Good morning, everyone, and welcome to those of you who are here and those of you who are on Zoom. Now, I've got an admin thing to tell the Zoom people, which is at the end of the talk, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. And the way to do it on Zoom is to click the bottom of your screen, and you'll see something called Q&A. If you then click the Q&A, then it'll give you the chance to type your question, which we can then relay to the speaker at the end. Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome Jock to talk to us today. You may have come to his talk 2 years ago, yeah, some of you did, yes, when he talked about the submarine warfare in the Atlantic. Because Jock was in the Navy for, what, 30 years? He was in the Ministry of Defense for 20 years, and he's studied mammals. I don't know whether this is all his life, but I expect you're going to find out about that. And he's giving lots of talks. He tells me his next talk is going to be by Zoom in Norfolk, Virginia. So he's obviously quite a man in demand. Jock, it's a great pleasure to welcome you this morning, and we're greatly looking forward to your talk.
Hamish, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank those of you who are here. You exceeded my prior expectations. I was intending, if it could come down to my expectations, to use a quote from Henry V, but I can see I don't need that. I'll also say hello to I'm told Hamish tells me, the countless thousands who are here via Zoom. So welcome to you too. I thought I'd start by a little bit of audience participation, and I call it what's in a name. And here's the first thing. I'm not going to ask you to say anything just yet. Here's the second thing, and here's the third thing. So what is the first thing called?
Jellyfish.
It's not a fish. What is the second thing called?
Bear.
It's not a bear. And what is this last thing called? An orca, a killer whale. It's not a whale. But apart from that, you've done extremely well. So I'm very grateful to you for that. I will seek some further audience participation a little later. All I'm trying to get across is we've sometimes got to be a little careful with some of the labels we put on things, and this is an example. I could have told you, for instance, that the sound effects as you were coming in were the wails of anguish of the people who couldn't make it here today, but in fact they were humpback whales. Right, so what we're going to look at today, we're going to talk about not just mammals, but marine mammals, of which, of course, they are only some of the inhabitants of the sea. The great number of inhabitants of the sea are not mammals at all. They're fish or various other things which are not direct air-breathing creatures, whereas mammals are air-breathing. We're going to look at the history of this, where we're at now, and what is to be done. And I use the word orca there, not because it's a term for what is commonly called the killer whale, but because it's actually the name of an organization as well, in which I'm involved, and I will talk about a little later. So we've got to look now at the ground, or to be more correct, the sea that we have to cover with this. So marine mammals. And marine mammals, there is quite a lot of diversity of them. Just about the only thing you can say about them is none of them are particularly small. They tend to have a sort of minimum size. And I think we can see, if you like, one law of zoological development at work there. What is the scope of marine mammals? Well, we have a number. If we could start with the ones which are probably likely to be most familiar, we're looking at creatures such as seals and walruses. A little bit further up the size spectrum, you have dolphins and porpoises. Now, once upon a time, I could say to a lot of people, you've probably seen them in a dolphin show somewhere. Well, there aren't too many dolphin shows around now, thank goodness. But dolphins and porpoises are very similar creatures. And lastly, there are whales. And it's quite difficult to show a real world photograph of all of a whale. So there you can see the tail portion of, again, a humpback whale. This was one, I was very lucky, a couple of years ago. I was at a conference in America. I had a couple of days to spare. I was on the West Coast. I went to a place called Monterey in California. And Monterey in California is a wonderful place to go and look at whales. And I spent 8 hours in a boat out over the top of what's called the Monterey Trench. The Monterey Trench is excellent for whale watching. Why is that? Because it is a very deep abyss and it brings up, there are upwellings of lots of food and nutrients. And that's why you get a lot of life there. And that is an example of it. So they're also known zoologically as cetaceans, whales and dolphins are anyway, not the seals, but they're known as. So what are the main types? And there's fundamentally one main division. And the one main division is that there are toothed ones which rely on their teeth for catching prey. And examples of this are the beaked whale, the pilot whale, and the sperm whale. Here is a sperm whale. They are quite enormous. And unfortunately, I haven't really got the means of getting across the size apart from the odd illustration I have. But the sperm whale is enormous. And the sperm whale was so called because that huge head section that you see contains a liquid which was very useful for a thing called spermaceti oil, which was very useful for such things as lighting in the pre-electricity age. And this drove a lot of the interest in the whales. Now, there are also what are called baleen whales. Now, baleen is the technical term for their method of food collection, which is quite different. And they don't have teeth. What they have instead is a giant comb-like structure. And what they do is they eat very much smaller creatures than the toothed whales do, and they ingest a mouthful of these, and then they expel, and the food is caught on the baleen. And the baleen has other uses as well, as we'll discover. Examples, the blue whale, which is the biggest living creature in the world. The minke whale, you may have heard of the minke recently. There was one, unfortunately, came to grief in Teddington Lock on the Thames, which was a young minke whale. And the humpback, which is, again, this is again a picture of part of a humpback whale. And I think you can see why they're so called. Right, I'll now move on to looking at some characteristics of whales and the way they do things. What are we looking at? The distribution is virtually worldwide, from the Antarctic to the Arctic, and some of them conduct very long migrations, as I said. There are other creatures, particularly seals and walruses, which tend to have rather more static habitats, but the whales, particularly the larger ones, do go on long migrations. And we're now seeing some of the less usual ones. I referred to the minke in Teddington Lock, and that's a good example, a lost whale. But we're also seeing differences in the migration patterns, some of which are almost certainly caused by food, and in turn, that is almost certainly caused by ocean warming and climate change. So it does have an effect on it, but some of them travel in the course of a year thousands of miles. I know at the other end of the scale, so too do lots of small birds, but this is what a lot of the great whales do. Now, I'd like to look just briefly at some of some of their behaviors. Some of them exist in what are called pods, groups of pods. They're known as pods, and they can take various forms. Often you see a mother with a younger whale. Sometimes they will be just by themselves. Sometimes they will be with others. Some are, the word one would almost use, are notorious for groups, one of which, of course, is the orca, or killer whale, the one that's actually a dolphin. It's a huge dolphin, but it is a dolphin, not a whale. And they, of course, are in groups. The slightly strange thing about those groups is that those groups are actually ruled by a matriarch, not a patriarch. And as young ones grow up, they tend to split off from that and form into other groups. What rules almost their whole lives is the search for food. And some species dive very deep. They can actually go down to about 2,000 feet. They can be submerged for about 40 minutes or so, possibly longer. They make, as you've heard already, they make a lot of use of sound. And they use it for two things. One is for locating prey by echolocation, like just imagine bats, but on a bigger scale. And you get some idea of what they do. They use it for prey location. They also use it for communication. Now, what exactly they're trying to communicate, we really do not know. There are all sorts of theories about what their communication's about. I was talking to someone before we started about a very interesting phenomenon that's just been observed in the last year or so scientifically, which is that some humpback whales go to some remote islands every year in the South Atlantic called the Kerguelen Islands. There they meet other groups of whales, and they actually exchange their repertoire of sounds, which is very interesting behavior indeed. So it's communication, but what they're actually trying to communicate, we really don't know. There's a similar thing applies to some of their antics when they come to the surface. Humpback whales in particular have been known to carry out various maneuvers. They slap their tails, they will broach, which means they more or less, as far as they can, come out of the sea. And again, we do not know exactly what they're doing. It may be a form of communication. It may be some form of warning off other creatures. It may simply be that they've noticed there's a boat nearby and they think they better do something to amuse us. We do not know. And I suspect we're not on the brink of discovering why. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit. Whales go back millennia. And I'd like to talk, however, a very much shorter time span about the history of whaling. That goes back quite a long time and centuries. And in fact, if you go to the Bible, you find the story of Jonah and the whale. However, it's sometimes referred to in some translations as a great fish. People weren't particularly good at distinguishing marine mammals from fish in those days, but in any case, there is a problem with Jonah and the whale. The main problem are the physical difficulties, not just of a whale ingesting a man, but more importantly, of the man coming out again in one piece. And not only are there in many species of whales physical restrictions on their gastrointestinal system, which would prevent it really happening into, I think the phrase used in the Bible is the belly of the great fish. But furthermore, some of these are to aid digestion, some of these are extremely toxic environments. And if you don't understand that, next time you see a doctor, I know most of us haven't seen a doctor for a very long time, but next time you see a doctor, ask him about the contents of the permanent contents of your stomach. It'll probably put you off food for quite some time. But the whale is even more so. So I think we have to say the story of Jonah and the whale is probably allegorical. But why hunt whales? Well, there are a number of things they're after. I've alluded earlier to the whale providing oil. And in the pre-electric age, this was one of the most important products of the whale, was the oil, because it was excellent for lighting. It was better than most of the other things that were there. It burned more cleanly. It made, believe it or not, less smell, but it was excellent for lighting. And of course, there weren't very many things around for lighting in those days. Of course, come electric lighting, then I'm afraid there is no need for that, or very little need for it. It was also used, particularly in some communities, some specific communities, for food. Now, I will come on to the business of the Japanese and the whale a little later. However, I have to say, having enjoyed several Japanese meals in Japan, there are several aspects to a Japanese meal, one of which is there are lots and lots of different dishes. The other of which you frankly, even if it's explained to you, don't actually know what you're eating. So it's entirely possible that without knowing, I have eaten whale. I just don't know. And lastly, I'll mention whalebone, the baleen, the comb-like substance found in the snout. And whalebone had a great market in the 19th century, particularly. Audience, what was the market for?
Corsets.
Corsets, that's right. I didn't have one myself, but I'm told it was. And it's also, as far as I'm aware, it causes the only mention of the whale in the works of Johann Sebastian Bach. because it does come up there. Now, come on, who's music? Is there anybody musical here? I think there's one at the back, isn't there? Is there somebody musical here? Can you tell me which work mention of whalebone occurs? No, obviously, the coffee cantata. I did actually discover this in the last couple of months, but it's the only time, because I don't think Bach ever went particularly near the sea. So he wouldn't have done that. Unlike Albrecht Dürer, the painter and engraver, who actually made a visit to see a stranded whale. But the trouble is that traveling in medieval Germany, by the time he got there, it was long since got rid of. But there we are. Now, what nations have been involved themselves in whaling? Well, an awful lot is the answer. A lot of the Arctic people, what we used to call Eskimos, but prefer other names, and there are a number of different groupings of them. One which is less known about are the Basque people, who did a lot of whaling worldwide. You then have the Americans, and the American whaling thing was largely centered on New England. When I say it was centered on New England, that doesn't mean that they largely hunted whales off New England. They actually went as far as the Pacific. And this was because catching whales, catching their products was such an immensely lucrative thing, it was worth their while to go all that way there. Often around Cape Horn, which is not the most attractive of sea passages at the best of times. The British did a fair bit of whaling, and that only really ended after the end of the Second World War. One of the things you may have seen is a picture of the island of South Georgia in the South Atlantic. And one of the aspects of Grytviken Harbour in South Georgia are the site of all these whale ships, whale catchers, left to rot there, because it's not worthwhile to take them anywhere to break them up. Now, today we have a regime in which there are, and I put it deliberately in quotes, scientific catches. There are some nations who are allowed to catch whales for scientific research purposes. However, there must be some doubt as to the genuineness of that. Norway has got the biggest catch of whales in the world. Japan, as I've mentioned, and a lot of them end up, I think, being eaten, not being used for scientific or any other kind of research. Iceland, some, and there's still some native whaling, both in the Arctic, but actually also as close as the Faroe Islands. And I don't know, I've seen it a couple of times on television, a documentary about how once a year, the Faroe Islanders, they don't actually go to sea, they just capture them in nets close inshore. And they do use them for eating, but the Faroe Islanders are still allowed to catch pilot whales, which they do in big numbers. Now, I'd like to talk about the public consciousness of whales. And I'd like to think here about the 19th century. I mentioned that New England in America was a great home of this. And I'm going to put up a picture of a literary gentleman who was involved with a thing to do with whales. Does anybody like to say who they think this is?
Mark Twain?
No, I don't think Mark Twain was more of a Mississippi man, I think you'll find, Hamish, rather than a whale man. Anybody else?
Is it the author of Moby Dick? Yeah.
No, we'll come to that in a minute.
Okay.
But thank you for saying so. He is in fact British, and he is a man called William McGonagall, the poet and tragedian self-described of Dundee. And he wrote a poem about an incident that happened in 1883, where a humpback whale came into the River Tay. It was a matter of great wonder, and he wrote a poem about it. And it resulted in what I consider to be one of the worst couplets in English, Scots, or any literature, which goes as follows. And he describes how they went out in their boats to see the whale, and the whale flipped its tail, as I said to you, humpback whales often do. And the great shower of water went up, and McGonagall was on. Then the water did descend on the men in the boats, which wet their trousers and also their coats. This is a line I do not need to consult. I have had it engraved on my mind for quite a long time, as you might expect, and I hope you will now have it engraved on your minds. All right. Good try, Stephen. Thank you. So who is this then? Does anybody know? Melville, Herman Melville, that's right. Herman Melville, who also wrote in approximately the same time period. He wrote an awful lot. He wrote particularly a book called Moby Dick. And I think some of you know the fundamental theme of Moby Dick, which is an obsessed captain, Ahab, who goes in search of this great white whale, which had given him a wooden leg. I don't mean literally give him a wooden leg. I mean, it had resulted in him having a wooden leg. And it ends up with the whale. Should I tell you this actually, or should I just recommend that you read the book? No, I'll tell you it. The thing was that the whale ended up destroying the whaling ship. Now, a lot of people for a lot of time thought that that was actually a bit fantastical. In fact, there'd been 2 New England whalers lost after being rammed by a whale. And so actually, Melville based this book on reality. Now, depending on which edition you get, even the ones without pictures, you are looking at a long read between 376 and 927 pages, depending on which edition you get. But in my view, it's still well worth reading. It's not a boast, it's just a fact. I have read it 3 times, and I've every intention of reading it at least once more. And you get a lot of detail about American 19th century whaling, what's involved. Now, much as we may disapprove of the idea of whaling, the fact is that those people put a lot of effort and put themselves in a lot of danger in order to do this. And it was not an easy profession. Melville also has philosophy in it, and it's a darn good story. So if you haven't read it, I would recommend it to you. I wouldn't necessarily go for the 927-page one, but I'd still recommend it to you. Now, I'll say one more thing about the Moby Dick story, and that is that there was a film made of Moby Dick in the 1950s, and that film used a made-up whale, a mechanical whale, if you like. The technology then was not particularly good, and it gave the filmmakers a heck of a lot of trouble. And some years later, of course, when Steven Spielberg made Jaws, the technology was a whole lot better, and that was a much happier experience. It's also a smaller animal as well, but nevertheless, the point is that it was a difficulty. Now, one of the supporting cast in the film, the Captain Ahab, incidentally, was played by Gregory Peck, but one of the supporting cast was a clergyman who gave a sermon, Father Mapple. And Father Mapple was played by this stage, the aging and growing ever larger Orson Welles. And some of the cynics, observing all the trouble with the mechanical whale, said they should have actually signed up Orson Welles to be the whale. Right, okay, so where are we now? I'm going to look at whaling populations and threats to those populations. Now, whaling continues to be a problem. However, it is fair to say that the curtailment of whaling in the 20th century, the course of the 20th century, is such that it isn't anything like the problem it used to be. And there were groups of whales, species of whales, which were on their way to becoming extinct. And the curtailment of whaling has at least meant that a lot of these have not only stopped shrinking, but have actually started growing again. And that's to the good. But it's something that needs to be kept an eye on. There is also the problem of plastics and other pollutants in the sea. And as an example of this, there is a pod of ORCA, killer whales, which can be found west of UK, normally off Scotland, but I gather that 1 or 2 of them were actually seen off Cornwall earlier this year. And of that group, of that pod, they have not produced a birth of a orca in something like 12 to 15 years. Now, we do not know exactly why this is the case, but we think the case is to do with ocean pollution. So there is at least one other good reason for not doing it. You have other things as well that can be problematical. Offshore wind farms. Now, you might think that the main problem is that there is something stuck in the water there. And that is a slight problem, but they've got the means to deal with that. The main problem really is the various kinds of noise produced by such installations. So I'm afraid, as we solve one of our problems, we may be making another. And lastly, I mentioned something called ship strikes, which is a cause for concern. And ship strikes is quite simply a ship hitting a whale. Whale's pretty big, but the size of ships these days are much bigger. They're forever producing ever bigger container ships, for instance. And there's a lot of research going on about what actually is the way the problem works out and what can be done to alleviate it. Now, some of the researchers have suggested that the solution lies in the painting of the bows of ships in a rather more lurid color than they already are. I think that may be hopeful, but possibly dubious. And one of the reasons for this, I say, is because some of the ship strikes occur at night, and it doesn't matter what color you are there. Whales don't generally go around with means of illumination. The other thing is that whales are not particularly visual animals. They do have eyes and they can see, but I think the problem may actually also be related to sound. Now, you might think that one huge tanker bulk carrier, that is quite a noisy thing. And so it is from certain angles, from certain aspects. So if you're anywhere near the rear of it, yes, you can hear the propeller thudding away, and as indeed even can a whale. If you're near the front, such as the size of some of these ships, that you can't actually hear those. And it's usually the front of the ship that hits the whale. So it's a thing that needs quite a lot of further research. So what do we do about it, or what can we do about it? Well, I think the single most important thing is to clean up the oceans. Now, that is a very easy thing to say, 3 words, but it involves an awful lot of actual work. And it's a very difficult thing to do, not least because of the period in which we've been polluting the oceans on quite a large scale. So it's not something I think that's likely to yield sudden, quick, easy to see results. It should nevertheless still be tackled. Curtail whaling. Well, it's been curtailed a fair amount, but there are still nations who would like to do it, and there are still nations doing it. And in fact, I mean, I mentioned the Norwegians earlier, they tend to catch one species, which is the minke whale. And the populations are in reasonably stable state. But if other nations decided they wanted to whale again, then I think it might make for some difficulties. So we've got to try to keep that in check. But the most important single thing is to know what is happening. And as these creatures are in the ocean, as they don't spend all their time displaying in front of observers, we've got to say, do we actually know what's going on? Do we know what the size of populations are? Do we know what their behaviors are? Do we know where they are or where they go? And the answer is a lot of the time, no, we don't. We know quite honestly more about some things that are happening in outer space than we do in this inner space. So what can we do to try to discover more? Well, this is where I've mentioned the organization called ORCA, which I belong to, which is based in Portsmouth. And it basically looks at 3 things. One is education. I first encountered ORCA when I did what's called a Marine Mammal Surveyors course. And it's a 1-day, fairly intensive course which you do. You have to pay for it, but you do it, after which you are qualified to do this. I say qualified, you actually have to go and get some experience as well. They also support certain cruise ships, and in particular, the ones I've mentioned are Saga, and Saga often have on board a team from ORCA, who are there to do a number of things. Yes, they're there to look for whales, but they're also there to educate people who are on the cruises. And they actually work very hard doing that. They tend to do things like some of the sort of cruises up to the Arctic in summer. Basically, if it's daylight, there's usually at least one, if not more of them around. And as a result, they don't get a lot of sleep. So they work quite hard. And lastly, I'll mention surveys, which is what I've done myself most of the time. Surveys are done by going to sea in usually ferries, different ones. There are ones operate up in Scotland. There is the ferry between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. And the one I've done a fair amount of has been cross-channel ferries. And cross-channel ferries vary from Dover-Calais in the east to Plymouth, Roscoff, and sometimes Plymouth Santander in the west. And you can see there a member of the team. What happens is typically 4 people go on board a ferry. You're invited up to the bridge after she's cleared harbour, and you have a team leader, plus at any given time, a port side, left-hand side, and a starboard side, right-hand side observer, and someone doing the recording. Now, when I started a few years ago, all the recording was done on forms, on a clipboard, and everything had to be written down. We're moving towards a better system. One of the most boring things was as soon as anybody saw anything, you'd rush across to the ship's sat-nav, write down the position in latitudes and longitudes, and then record everything else. Now, one of the advantages of the tablet system they've got now is that will automatically record such information for you. You just say there's an event, and you then put in the details. They've also worked towards, and they're about to launch a phone app, which can be used independently of these things. So anybody, if you're just walking beside the seaside and you see something, you can use it. It's not yet been launched, but I've trained on it as well. And that is a useful tool as well. Now, where do these surveys go? I've mentioned in general terms where they go. I realize this is probably a little small, but fundamentally you can see in various forms of lines where they go to. They have gone to places like Norway and to the Netherlands in the past. They also say occasionally go to Spain, but their main area of effort is the Channel. Now, the Channel is not fantastic territory, despite what all you may have heard about various stray whales being in places. You're not likely to see a full-size whale on any given trip. However, what you will see almost certainly are dolphins and other creatures, similar to creatures called harbor porpoises. What you also will occasionally see is something else. So I, for instance, on one of the trips to Roscoff in Brittany, on the way back, the team leader and I both saw what we think was a minke whale. I say think because one of the things you've got to do is to be precise with your observations. And in being precise with your observations, if you don't know what it is, you should not attempt to guess what it is. And there are various ways of telling. You never see the whole thing. So you're only seeing a bit of it. You are basing part of it on appearance, which may be some distance away with a whale rather than a dolphin. And you're also looking at behavior as well. So you often have to say, I saw something, it was almost certainly a whale, probably a minke whale, but we don't know for sure. And other than that, you're not doing the survey properly. So what happens to this information? Well, it gets put into, it's all loaded down into various databases held at different universities. And that scientific data is all added together and it produces a pattern of information, or it aids in the pattern. And what a lot of the time you're trying to see is not so much what is there on any particular day in any particular place, it's really changes in patterns. And that's what you're looking for. And this comes out in specific reports. In particular, there is a report which comes out, it hasn't come out for a year or two now, although there's a draft page I'm about to show you from this year's, called The State of European Cetaceans. And it goes through in great detail a lot of what has been seen, what we know about behaviors, areas, various patterns. And it's hopefully you combine these over the years, you start to see trends. It's probably a little too difficult to read, but this is an extract from this year's one. And it does admittedly go back to 2019 because we didn't do any of this at all in 2020. And we haven't started doing it yet again in 2021. I hope we will before the year is up, but that's not down to me. 2019, 14,112 cetaceans, 29 species, various other information. And this is just a summary of what's been done. So, ladies and gentlemen, you've been a very good audience. You've spoken when I've asked you to speak, usually because I've misled you a bit, possibly deliberately. You'll have to make your mind up about that. But I would ask from this audience and from the Zoom audience, if you'd like to make any questions or comments, and I will try my best to say something about that.
So I'd like to ask it. It's about the Japanese and their insistence that they're doing it for research. What research? Because if we're going to kill the animals, and there's not a great call for whale meat in Japan, it's not a great delicacy. So, I mean, I understand that some of the whale meat is used as sort of animal food or things like that. It seems to be that they're being unnecessarily obstructive, so we've got to do research.
I wouldn't disagree with you, wholeheartedly. We were asked about why the Japanese are doing research and what do they use things for, and also the possibility that much of the whale meat is either discarded or given as animal feed. I wouldn't disagree with any of that. However, they have had a long-term primacy in this field. And it really is a residual thing. It's there is some research done. It would be wrong to say they don't do any at all. But at the same time, I don't think that the amount of kill they have justifies the amount of research they do. And I think there may come a time where the Japanese and the Norwegians, for that matter, may have to stop.
Yeah, there is an international bodies of some sort. Surely.
Well, there is a thing called the International Whaling Commission,
Yeah.
and this is very much the regulatory body. But the trouble is with all international agreements is that it's sometimes difficult to enforce things. And even the things that you do allow, I mean, a lot of it it's done. I mean, the people like the Faroe Islanders and some of the Arctic peoples, that's because they've always done it.
Yes,
and
so
they're allowed
take
that.
it away, otherwise you'll be anti-black or something.
Well, I don't think there are too many
No,
black whalers,
yeah.
although there was one, of course, at least one in Moby Dick,
Yes.
as you'll discover when you read it.
Yes. Jock, we need to repeat the question so people can hear.
Yes, Stephen.
Jock, where should we go to have the best chance of seeing something exciting? I remember I've been across the Bay of Biscay on Brittany ferries, and we did see something. Would that perhaps be the best chance for us locally?
Well, I've been asked where the best place is to see some of this, and it was mentioned that the questioner asked said they'd been to the Bay of Biscay and they'd certainly seen something there. Not all of us are lucky enough to have been to the Monterey Trench of Monterey, California, and I would certainly recommend it. However, I think the more realistic thing has been suggested by the questioner which are the ferries that cross the Bay of Biscay on the way to northern Spain. And this is a well-known area where, again, there's a lot of food available through what are called upwellings. And that produces a lot of interest. I was supposed to go a couple of years ago on what the ORCA calls a sea safari, which is a non-surveyed one on the ferry to northwest Spain. And then about 48 hours before it was due to start, the ferry caught fire. So we never had it, and we've never been able to reschedule it. But I'd love to do that, because the Bay of Biscay, admittedly in daylight, is supposed to be a very, very good place indeed, and the places round us. Other than that, I would suggest going north, young man.
Thank you.
I've got 3 hands up there. I'll take that one first, if I may, please. Amish.
Thank you for a super presentation first. I've just finished a book on animal navigation. I don't remember whales or porpoises being mentioned. Do we know how they navigate? Do you have any idea?
I've been asked, the questioner had read a book recently on animal navigation and noted the absence of whales and other marine mammals. How do they navigate? We don't really know, is the short answer. It's probable there are biological clues, in particular to do with the availability of food. The other thing is that they may well have, this is one of the things that is not fully understood, is the role of memory, not just in marine mammals, but in other things as well. Now, I recently, like you, read a thing about animal, and it included bird and, for that matter, butterfly migrations. And the thing that got me was one of the butterfly migrations, where they fly from somewhere in North America to somewhere in South America every year, thousands of miles. But the one you see the next year back in North America is not actually the same creature. And it's not the child, it's the grandchild. So they're clearly embedded things in there. Now, all you can do in a case like this is say, this happened. Well, we don't know, of course. And bear in mind, if you're looking at something like a blue whale, which is taking its calf up the west coast of America, let's say, then the calf will be taking in a lot of the information that the adult will have known, and the adult will have been a calf in its own time. But we just do not know exactly. My money would be on sort of biological things. But as we know, all sorts of animals do this. We know salmon and eels go back to their original spawning grounds. And so it's still a little mysterious.
Insects too.
Insects
also have navigations.
Well, as butterflies.
Polarization of light.
Yes.
Some sort of magnetic compass.
Yes. Well, it's quite possible that cetaceans use some kind of magnetic thing, but we just don't know. And the interesting question is, there are all these possible answers. Let's assume, for instance, that they use 2 or even 3 of these. How do they integrate them? Very interesting question. Now, I saw at least 2 other hands up.
How does a blue whale, for example, deal with microplastic?
With
microplastic?
How does a blue whale deal with microplastic? The sad answer is not terribly well. And bear in mind, it can get to them in 2 ways. One is in this surrounding water, and the other is in what they eat. So there have been instances of whales found, dead whales found, with significant quantities of plastic in their digestive systems. So the answer is they can't deal with it in the sense of digesting it. They may deal with it in the sense of excreting some of it. And again, all we can do is note that it is a problem for them, and it's not helping things.
I was thinking the blue whale might filter out the majority of the microbes, but some would enter its digestive system. Yes,
and of course there is in the water alone. There are, and the key is in the name microplastic, because you're looking at creatures that are smaller than a baleen whale would eat. So I find it very, and of course these creatures in turn may have plastics in them. So it's not an easy area, that, and it's an even more difficult area. I mean, it's very simple to say we just stop dumping plastics in the sea, but the trouble is there's a whole lot of them there now. So how do we deal with the ones that are already there? And two-word answer: with difficulty. A very patient gentleman.
Yes.
Yeah.
So why is the killer whale not a whale? What is it? And what differentiates it from the true whales?
It is. Why is the killer whale not a whale? Good question. The thing is, it's just really zoologically a very large dolphin. The other thing is the entomology. How does the term killer whale come? Now, the only even halfway satisfactory explanation I got was over a pint of beer at a meeting of ORCA team leaders. And I posed this question: why is it called the killer whale when it's not a whale? And the suggestion was it had originated because it was called, it was known as the killer of whales. And what I will say is that they are apex predators, killer whales. They may look very cuddly if you buy a cuddly toy of them, but they ain't cuddly at all. And for example, a news story in the last few months was one about how killer whales had adversely impacted the income of certain people in South Africa. And the way this had happened was that certain people in South Africa had been selling tourist trips to see great white sharks, safely, obviously. And they would take them out to see the great white sharks. The only trouble was, all of a sudden, no great white sharks anymore. And it was discovered that they'd been attacked by ORCA, and that the ORCA were very fussy eaters and had not actually eaten all of the great white sharks. They'd only eaten their livers. So they're rather fussy eaters, but they had driven great white sharks away from South Africa. That said, I did see a report the other day of some water skier or surfboarder off South Africa who'd been attacked by one. So perhaps they're making a comeback. Are there any from Zoom?
No, none from Zoom. But how big are the calves when they're born? And how dependent are they on their mothers?
How big? I've been asked how big the calves are when they're born and how dependent on their mothers. Obviously, it's dependent on species. And what we certainly say is, and this is a generalization, you're probably looking at about them being something like 5 to 10% of their mother's body weight. However, they can stay with their parents for, it depends again on species, but they can stay with their parents for years in some instances, and they do stay for years with their mother, and then eventually they will become independent. Now, I mentioned earlier the ORCA and the idea that you often get this grouping of a matriarch and several others. You get there a sort of in-between state where some of the young males may be actually quite adult, but they still stay with the pod for a number of years. The matriarch is not necessarily their mother, but they stay with the pod for a number of years before deciding that it's time to go off and start out independently. So it varies hugely, the period of time they spend with an adult, but they will stay with the mother very closely. Now, one of the less pleasant things that ORCA do on the west coast of America, the blue whale, largest creature in the world, you will often find they're doing the migration from south to north, and they get to Monterey Bay, and they have to make a decision. The adult has to make a decision. Do they go inshore, where there is relatively, but it takes longer to traverse there, because obviously the adult has to go at the same speed as the young, with usually a single young, or do they actually cut across the bay and that's quicker, but it's not so good for food. But the orca often prey on those, and they won't go for the adult because that's just too big a prey target for them. They will go for the young, and they will often get it. So it's a very variable thing, depending, as I say, largely on species.
Any more questions?
Is there an organisation that is trying to stop plastic pollution? That's the most damaging thing
I believe there. I believe.
Climate change as well.
I believe there is, both in terms of general environmental organisations, and there may be a specific one. I'm not. Sorry.
Greenpeace people.
Well, I've been asked about organisations who are trying to do something about plastic. I think there are a number of organisations who that will be amongst their aims. I'm not aware of one whose specific and sole aim is that. But there are certainly a number of organisations of that kind. Greenpeace you mentioned, yes, but there could be others. My experience, my expertise lies in the surveying of what there is, not actually necessarily going out and doing anything about it. I'm sorry to say. Perhaps if I had more time, I might do something like that.
If you take away the cause of the problem, if the cause is all reductions in numbers and rates, then it's consequences. You could just deal with human responsibility.
I don't disagree with that in the slightest. But as I pointed out, even if we were to stop doing it tomorrow, there'd still be a very large scale residual problem.
Let me be visible here with you. It gives me great pleasure to thank Jock for his talk. We're getting so many excellent talks with people with enthusiasm for their subject and huge knowledge. And if you weren't impressed by his talk, you must have been impressed by his way of answering questions. It shows such a huge command of the subject. Jock, thank you very much for an excellent talk.
Thank you for asking me.
No, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hamish.
No, it's excellent. I'm very pleased. Thank you.